Welcome to Live Your True Story. This is your host, Meteoric, and we're going to be exploring the lives of people who discovered their true path and are living very unique lives because of it. Not only are we going to be learning about the very interesting things that they're doing, but also learn how they broke from the mold and decided to take the adventure of living their own lives. Feel free to visit my Substack at meeok, that's meeok.substack.com, for a convenient list of links to all of the things discussed during our chat. And to learn more about my journey and services, please visit HoldingCompassionate.space. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with me as I move out of the country. I have moved. I am in Oaxaca, Mexico. And as moves go, it's been a little bit of a bumpy ride. It's definitely the right move, and it's amazing. And once I'm settled, it will be a beautiful life, but it has taken a little longer than I thought. I haven't been able to focus much on my Substack, so I apologize for the remission, or actually I don't apologize. Women apologize too much. It has been on my mind though, and before I left the States, I talked with my friend Q, who is just amazing. I mean, it's not every day that two Korean queer ladies meet in a German Harvard class that is centered around the literary and visual culture of the gayest and most amazing, in my opinion, decade of the modern era, the modern Babylon that was Weimar Germany. It's the era in which cabaret takes place. There was also sort of a sister situation going on in Paris, and so it's the beginning of gay liberation and all that kind of stuff. Really, really fascinating. So this is where Q and I met, and we've been super buds ever since. Her imposing intelligence never fails to impress me. Our conversations continue to be extremely interesting, although when two Koreans get together that not only fall outside of the mainstream, but also out of our own marginal spaces of Koreanness and all of that, the conversations get pretty nuts. And so I did buckle up my safety belt and I did put on my oxygen mask first, but I gotta tell you, and you can hear it, even though I tried to stick to the theme of the podcast and keep it on the rails, there are no rails with Q. And so we ended up having a sort of mutual office hours of just the pontifications of some really intense minds interested in history and philosophy and the crossover from antiquity to modernity and East and West and North and South. And so I hope this is a fun and edifying conversation that leaves you with much to chew on and more questions than you ever imagined. Thanks so much for your patience, and I hope to be back on track within the next month or so. I will be talking a little bit more about the upcoming retreat, and I will also be featuring my dear medicine sister Tanya as soon as we have a chance to sit down and talk about the medicine work that we have done and that we will be bringing to future retreats as we support this amazing work. So I now give you my friend Q and our diagnostics on where we're going and how the hell we got into this handbasket.
Hi, Mio. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
How the fuck are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm getting ready to get the hell out of the US, which feels really good, particularly right now. Yeah, did you read my post?
I read your article.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's just fucking crazy. Like, I don't know, like, how, so much happened in, like, the past, like, 2 years, 3 years for you. I mean, like, in the past, like, 10 years, but in terms of, like, bringing out your gifts to the world, you know, and, like, concretizing and materializing it in a way that sustains other aspects of your life, you know, that is, like, holistic. I think that's fucking awesome.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So, okay, let's chat about your background because you are impressive. On paper, you're like the Korean daughter that everybody wants. You've got Harvard, you've got Yale, you did the things, and now you're teaching. But I want to kind of give people a sense of like how we met.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting thinking back to how we met. It's so crazy because I feel like at that point we were in an exploratory phase and an enrichment phase, like before the crisis, like calm before the storm. And so it was a moment, at least for both of us, it seemed like of idealism. And that was very much embodied in the space where we met, which was art during the Weimar era, taught by Benjamin Buchloh.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Um,
no. It was Maria Tatar. We were at Harvard in the German department
yes.
with Maria Tatar, and the class was literature and visual art in Weimar.
Yeah.
And it was a smaller class. There wasn't like a ton of people. I don't know. I mean,
It
some of them.
was in German, right?
No, it
Was
wasn't.
it?
No, my
Oh,
German was not good enough. I would have been like, what? No,
oh.
this was in English, and so all right, so there's lots of great stuff here. So Maria Tatar is this amazing scholar. She's Hungarian or of Hungarian descent. She runs the
Oh,
mytho.
yes, yes, yes. I don't know. I took so many. It's a film class, right?
No, no, no. It was literature and art.
Why am I not remembering this?
Drugs, girl. There were lots of drugs involved in that time period. I mean, I had your little gay boys calling me drunk after
Yes.
these. So Maria is the chair, or she was at that time, she may still be the chair of mythology and folklore at Harvard.
Hmm.
From what I understand, she's the founder of children's literature. So she was kind of the person to read children's literature when she had children and say, no, 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 this is actually literary. This is
Hmm.
actually a genre and it's literature. It's not just like, stupid childhood stories. Like we should actually analyze this and treat this as literature.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so she's done amazing work with these incredible translations. When I was in the hospital, she brought me like this fabulous Peter Pan book. She's also written about Weimar. And so, can you tell people what the hell Weimar is?
Well, it's like that like war period, and it's sort of just like the decadence of a nation where you're starting to see like glimmers of the rise of the next period of Germany, which will be World War II. How that decadence is not only embodied in sort of the representations of very jarring expressions of urban bustling life, you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
the like industrialization and the modernizing of nations, especially at the turn of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
And
So,
like the consolidation of mythologies within the construction of the idea of nationhood, especially as
yeah.
Germany's
So you're
construction.
like you're skipping a lot of
Yes,
steps here. So
yes,
Weimar is it's spelled Weimar because
yes,
W is V in German. And the Weimar Republic was a period of time, about a little over a decade, between World War One, when Germany was kind of crushed. And during that time was the rise of Hitler, and then
yes.
and then it entered World War II. So between that time period, Germany had Weimar. And it was this weird sort of respite where the whole system collapsed. Like the Deutschmark, the inflation was totally super insane. Like you needed like $1 million to buy a loaf of bread or something like ridiculous. Like I think you can buy these old Deutschmarks on eBay or something.
That's
It's like,
amazing because they're just like
gazillion
so.
dollar, yeah, gazillion dollar Deutschmarks. But this period was sort of a modern Babylon.
That's interesting that you said it's like a respite or a Babylon. I think yes, but like this interwar period where you go from World War One to World War Two to the consolidation of power under Hitler, that construction, it's interesting that you're talking about Maria Tatar and like stories, mythologies, the idea of nationhood, especially as it's linked not only in terms of kinship, in terms of race and eugenics, the family as the keeper and protector and the
The
sort of
front.
bunker, the unit that forms this greater collective of community, which is linked through race to nationhood. And that's sort of the fascism, like fascism is an architecture. It's sort of pervasive. It gives a framework from banal quotidian life up to the highest levels of government, the most extreme form being totalitarianism, right? Like in North Korea, where it's a precise overarching framework for not only the ethics of your life, but then the performance of the ethics, even in your most private, secret lives. And like thinking about how these children's tales are at the most intimate levels of community or family life, of kinship, of lineage, the stories we tell our children, and how that carries on our legacy of not only telling our children who the hell we are, but who they are and where they come from, right? Or maybe the withholding parents who keep their past a mystery, like in Korean immigrant experiences. There are many different ways you can configure the role and place of children's stories as part of this larger like stitch within nation, especially with the Korean immigrant experience where the theory of nation is split. So it's like, where do you keep your loyalties? Do you adapt to this new destination?
It's national divorce.
That's so funny. Yeah, exactly. And it's just sort of like the different ways you adapt the stories you told about your past to the host country. Like my parents from Korea to the United States, it's interesting. Like my dad completely held on to this Korean cultural authoritarian military dictatorship version of Korea. He's a Korean ethnic nationalist, like as in he believes in the purity of the Korean blood,
Yeah.
quote unquote.
Yeah.
Like not only that we share a blood, which is a race, but that we are a homogeneous ethnicity. So it's not just race and ethnicity, but it's also that's bound up in nation.
Yeah.
And there was this survey, I read it in this book by Nadia Y. Kim, Imperial Citizens. She talks about race in Korea, race and ethnic nationalism. And like basically, there's a survey in the early 2000s, and it's very recent in some ways, asking whether Koreans believe that citizens were bound through blood. And a startling proportion responded yes.
That was a big problem with adoption, with why international adoption was launched, was because on the one hand, you had the one drop rule in America. And then in Korea, you had this really sort of Nazi eugenic blood purity philosophy. And so, what do you do with these mixed race babies from the forced prostitution of Korean women and the
Absolutely.
children created with US soldiers who abandoned them?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Race, but also even like the inverse of that is how Korean nationals believe that Korean immigrants abroad, if they're like racially Korean, are still Koreans.
Sure.
And that was part of that survey. And I think like endemic in the idea of adoption is that there is this violation of the purity of a Korean family, whether or not the adoptee has any white or foreign blood in them. The idea of the adoptee is of a betrayal. You know what I mean? That even if it wasn't perpetrated by the adoptee themselves, they believe that in some ways they, through pure chance, in some ways just discriminate against adoptees because they'll never know Korea as a nation, the
Right.
language of Koreans. It's very common in Korean culture to be like, oh, it's a shame they don't know Korean, you know, or they should know Korean. They should know how to speak Korean. They're Korean just because they appear to be racially Korean in their eyes. Like my mother's generation, like they grew up in the 60s, you know, they believe that Koreans, just by virtue of being purely Korean, should adopt the cultures and customs of Korea, even within another nation, that they should be loyal. And that's the idea of nationhood, like racist ethnic nationalism.
Yeah, there's a lot of rich stuff there. I mean, it really speaks to why the Korean cult culture is so huge, why Judeo-Christianity was so appealing to the culture as well, that Jewish sort of ethnicity also tied in with diaspora. With
Definitely.
that Korea has the second largest behind the Jewish people who had a 2,000-year head start. And so that would kind of tie into all that. When I was in Korea, it is so homogeneous. I mean, I think I saw like a Black person in Seoul like the whole time.
Yeah, I
And
know what you mean.
you know what I mean? And it's,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
when I was there, it felt like in the way that a ghost town feels, where you're just like, wow, this used to be like a thing. Except the ghost town wasn't like the place, it was the people. It felt like here's a people who were really trained to be in empire. And it was almost like if a colony of bees were humans and there was no queen, the queen was dead, and all that was left was drones.
Wow.
That's really what it felt like. And
Interesting.
yeah, so it was like the vacancy, the ghost town was inside. And so it's kind of like, yeah, to me, it made total sense that it would be just the country of cults and have the largest mega churches because it's just this amazing soil just waiting for a queen bee.
So the history of Christianity in Korea actually starts with like Catholicism. So like there's also like a big Catholic contingent in Korea.
In
And it
everything.
starts with like the French missionaries at the turn of like the 20th century, like around like 1898 or something. Like but then like Koreans kicked them out. And then American missionaries, you know, Protestant Christian missionaries
Yeah.
start coming around like 1900s,
Mhm.
and they side with the Koreans during Japanese colonialism, especially once like Korea is annexed in 1910.
So just to clarify, so Korea is annexed by Japan in 1910.
Yes, exactly. It becomes a protectorate of Japan in 1905, and it was like basically the Korean Empire until then. And then once it becomes annexed by Japan, basically it's a colony.
I mean, so Korea is like the way history defines it, it was started in like 32 BC or something like that. Like it's, I went to the museum in Seoul.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Like it was around, it was like the 3200 BC-ish era. And it was really fascinating to see the art and the culture from dynasty to dynasty, because you could really see when there were periods of time when they just closed the borders because it's not an island, but it's a peninsula. So it only has, one way to the mainland. And when you would walk through the rooms where they closed their borders, that was the most boring shit I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it was just this incestuous, self referential, there was nothing new
Mm.
for centuries. There were no new ideas, there was no trade, there was no anything. It was just mindless drone like repetition. Then you would see like, oh, and then this emperor came along and opened it up, and then you'd be like, oh, okay, now it's like cool again, now stuff's moving. But it was just this really static, stuck era, and you'd see it for like hundreds of years. It's crazy.
Yeah, but I feel like Korean history is a little bit more complicated than that, just because like they are a peninsula, so they are connected to China. And there were a lot of incursions. And I think Korea became like a suzerainty. It's sort of this like military outpost of China. And so there were, yeah,
Yeah, well, Korea has been invaded more than any other country on Earth. I mean, it's not that.
yes.
I mean, it was, yeah, it started in 3200 BC and it's been invaded over 900 times. Like, that's a lot.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think there's always like an intermixing of ideas. I wouldn't say Korea is like really static or anything. Like I would just say that,
No, no, no. I'm just
mhm.
saying it was during certain dynasties when they closed their border.
Oh,
You would see that
yeah,
there
mhm.
was no movement at all, no energetic movement in art,
Interesting. I
no
see.
evolution, just time stopped there.
I feel like there are comparable periods like the Middle Ages or like the Dark Ages, you know, in European history, sort of like there wasn't like a prolific outpouring of art. It was more religious based, like religion based. That's where you get sort of like the art sort of like manifesting, coming up in the architecture and the cathedrals and like the sculpture that, or like the religious paintings or the altarpieces. But then you get the Renaissance thereafter where there's like a blowing up of that, you know, and then there are like, it's sort of comparable to sort of like, let's say like the Chosun dynasty, right? Like,
Okay, but I want to go back because I want to go back to
yes.
just how we met. You were talking about that time of idealism. We were so young then. We were children frolicking. And Harvard's a trip. I mean, I don't know. So you're from LA, you're in California, and you come from like a very, I would say, like humble lineage.
Yeah.
I've read your memoir pieces and it's amazing just how quickly the advancement from one generation to the next. Like your grandmother wasn't literate, right? I mean,
No.
you couldn't get an education as a female in
Mm.
Korea, and now you're like some PhD lady. Uh, so we were at Harvard, and for me, I was really struck by that culture because all the information was there, but none of the minds that mattered were there.
Mm.
Because it was like I was in these classes learning these things, and it was amazing just how normalized that sort of knowledge was, that none
Mm.
of them could actually distinguish what was special about it.
Mm.
And there was no awareness outside of the bubble that this just wasn't common knowledge.
Yes, I feel you.
Like I'd be in these classes, it'd be blowing my mind. My whole worldview would be shattering. And, I felt like I was surrounded by people who were like, well, this isn't going to be very helpful at my job at Bear Stearns, or like this isn't really applicable to when I go work for Time Warner or
Yeah,
whatever.
it's really interesting.
But the kinds of minds that were there, the way they thought, and I would like to add, I think Harvard's kind of the mental illness capital of the world also, from what I saw. Would you agree?
I belong in that camp, so I'm like,
Well, I mean, it's an academy, like I saw like the professors there and stuff. I was like, oh, these are like porn stars of the mind. The world revolves around these like brains that have been trained to operate in a certain way. And so you don't really have like that beginner's mind that's so important to bring in the perspective of how to take in this information,
yes.
if that makes sense. But anyway,
No,
so
no, definitely.
so we met as like two little Korean queers in like a German class with all these gay guys, which was fabulous. Thanks for listening to the free part of our conversation. To listen to the rest, become a paid subscriber over at my Substack at meeok, that's meeok, .substack.com. See you there.